Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us this morning as we'll go through this year's slate of legislative proposals. Please note that what we'll do in this session here today is introduce each proposal briefly. So this is not a full discussion of all of the possible implications or nuances of the various proposals. So as we conclude the session today, we'll also point you in the direction of additional resources that you have at your disposal to continue to get up to speed on all of the various proposals today. But this is intended to give you a good, solid understanding and introduction to all of our proposals. This year, we have 3 constitutional proposals. A constitutional proposal will require a 2/3 majority vote of our membership for it to be passed and approved into NAIA legislation. We also have 19 bylaws amendments or bylaws proposals. Those bylaws proposals will require a simple majority to be approved and passed into NAIA legislation. So with that, let's get started. Our first proposal this morning is an amendment to the NAIA Constitution related to female and minority representation on various councils and the National Coordinating Committee. Now you'll note that in our legislative lineup, we have a handful of different proposals that all relate to this same topic. And the reason that we have these segmented out into different proposals is because there are a variety of different places within our Constitution or our bylaws that speak to the composition of various councils, committees, and associations, all of which the sponsors here are seeking to make adjustments to. So the first proposal, 21C01, speaks specifically to the National Coordinating Committee, the National Administrative Council, the Council of Presidents, the Council for Student Athletes, and the Council for Faculty Athletic Representatives. On each of these groups, the proposal seeks to add 2 additional seats for female or minority representatives. On 2 of these groups, the National Coordinating Committee and the Council of Faculty Athletic Representatives, you'll note that there's language in the proposal that specifically says that this would be implemented, this proposal, if it was to be passed, at the next regularly occurring election cycle. An example of why that would need to be the case is with the National Coordinating Committee, those at-large members are selected by a vote of our entire NAIA membership at the NAIA annual business meeting. So we won't all have a chance to select new additional members if this was to be passed until the next business meeting of the NAIA. So at that point, we would seek to do additional nomination and selection of positions to add to the National Coordinating Committee based on this proposal if it was to be passed. This proposal, 21C02, also seeks to adjust the makeup or the composition of the Council of Faculty Athletic Representatives, but it's specific to including a student athlete on that council. The intention would be that a member of the Association for Student Athletes would now serve on the Council of Faculty Athletic Representatives. And the interest behind this is to make sure that there's a student voice in the room when the Council of Faculty Athletic Representatives is discussing academic policies or eligibility-related policies. The student athlete, if approved, would not be a voting member of the Council of Faculty Athletic Representatives, but would serve in a non-voting capacity. Proposal 21C03 is also a constitutional amendment that impacts the composition of one of our councils. So this proposal impacts the Council for Student Athletes, and currently, right now, the council includes a representative from the Faculty Athletic Representative Administration. So that means essentially any FAR on an NAIA campus can serve in that capacity and serve on the Council for Student Athletes. What this proposal would do would be adjust that from any member of the FARA, any FAR, to instead be a member who is currently on the Council of Faculty Athletic Representatives. And essentially what that means is it seeks to ensure that there is some connection between policy discussions that are happening at the CFAR level with those kind of conversations that are happening at the CSA level, essentially ensuring that the leadership of those 2 areas are in connection with one another. Our first bylaws proposal, 21B01, deals with new institutions coming into the NAIA, so those that are approved for membership and in their first year of NAIA membership. So currently the rule says that first-year members are not eligible for NAIA postseason participation, and also that they cannot count towards their conference's total number of institutions sponsoring a particular sport that would enable the conference to earn an automatic bid to the national championship. Under this proposal, first-year member institutions would be immediately eligible for NAIA postseason play. In addition, those first-year member institutions would also be able to count towards their conference's accounting of number of teams to get its first automatic bid or automatic qualifier in a particular sport. A first-year member under this proposal would not be able to count towards a second or a third bid for the conference. One other key thing to note is that within this proposal, as it relates to the counting of conference bids, this would allow a first-year member to either count towards its home or primary conferences automatic qualifiers. It would also allow that institution, if it was a per sport member of another conference, to count towards that other conference's accounting of total number of institutions to gain its first automatic qualification. (21B02) is a proposal that would create a new role or a new designation within the NAIA for a senior woman leader. Now what this would be a designation given to a member of an athletic department staff, so either an athletic administrator or potentially a coach who is female, and would designate them as that institution's senior woman leader. The proposal would then essentially ensure that this person has a seat at the table for athletic department key discussions, key leadership topics, and decision making. So as you'll see in the proposal, there are a variety of functions that are outlined that should be included in this person's responsibilities or their area of authority. Things like assisting in key discussions about leadership within the athletic department, assisting in budgetary conversations, ensuring that there's regular communication and contact with the athletics director, both for professional development for this particular person, as well as so that that person, the senior woman leader, could be raising issues and bringing things towards the athletic director that are of key concern or representing issues of interest to female athletic administrators on campus or to female student athletes. There's also a handful of additional functions that are listed as possible or recommended functions for this particular person, but there is leeway given there, recognizing that on various institutions, for one reason or another, that may not be appropriate based on this particular person's skill sets or areas of expertise or purely for workload purposes. So those additional items that are listed as permissive functions of this role would be things like involvement in personnel and hiring and firing decisions or sport oversight. This person, the senior woman leader, could be any female administrator or coach and would be designated by the athletics director. So it could be the most senior woman on an athletic department staff, but is not required to be. The key would be that whoever this person is, that the athletics director would feel comfortable with them in these types of conversations and functions, as the role would require that. Another key point to note is this is not in and of itself a new staff position or a new headcount. This is intended to be a role that is designated to somebody who is on staff. So as we might think about our faculty athletic representatives as an example, those are individuals whose primary role and responsibility is to be a member of the faculty. In addition, they serve in the position or in the role as FAR. Similarly here, we would expect that this person has a primary full-time role somewhere else within the athletic department, but also serves in the role as senior woman leader. The last thing to note is that while this proposal is written to be effective August 1st of this current year, it was not required for all institutions to satisfy this proposal if it was to be passed until August 1st of 2023. The intention there is to encourage institutions to begin complying or to begin putting themselves in position about thinking who would be an appropriate senior woman leader on their campus. But for some institutions that may take a little bit more time or be a little bit more challenging to identify the correct person. So for those institutions, they would have until August of 2023 to get there. This next proposal is the result of a few years' worth of work from the regular season formats task force. This group has been organized and has been working towards looking at all regular season formats across all of our sports in the NAIA to address a variety of challenges and concerns that have been raised related to student-athlete health and wellness, impact on academic success and performance, as well as things like cost and overall burden on athletic department staffs and student-athletes. The result of this conversation is resulting in this proposal, which seeks to address some things related to how our current regular seasons are structured in a number of sports in three primary ways. So in some of these sports, we will see reductions in the total maximum contest limit, or the maximum amount of games or competitions that a particular sport could play in within a given academic year. In other cases, we'll see that there is a recommended start date, or the earliest date on which practices for particular sports could occur. And in other cases, we'll see that there are start dates for games or for competitions, so the earliest date at which competitions for that particular sport could occur. So as it relates to game limits, we will see reductions in the sports of baseball and softball, both men's and women's basketball, cross country, men's and women's golf, men's and women's volleyball, and wrestling. Each of those sports is being recommended to have some amount of game or contest reduction. In addition, in the area of practice start dates, we do see some recommended start dates in a handful of sports. So most notably, we see this in a number of fall sports. So the reason for fall sports is that we recognize that there was becoming a real conflict between the time at which athletics were coming back on campuses and the burden or the drain that that put on the institution in being able to facilitate those athletes in coming back to campus quickly enough. Noting that that must be balanced with a recognition that those student athletes have to have time to acclimatize and get in shape prior to competitions. So there are specific dates in each of these cases. With our fall sports, we see that most of the fall sports, meaning cross country, men's and women's soccer, and volleyball, have practice start dates of 17 days before the team's first allowable competition. That does not mean the day on which that particular team has its first game, but it means 17 days prior to the date on which that sport could first schedule a game. So 17 days prior in most of those fall sports. The exception to this would be football, which has a recommended practice start date of 24 days prior to the first game. Recognizing that in football we do have some specific guidelines about a phased-in acclimatization approach, and that training and conditioning is certainly a concern with that sport in particular for a variety of reasons. So that relates to our fall sports. In our winter sports of wrestling and basketball, we see practice start dates of 35 days prior to those sports' first allowable competitions. Again, this is not that particular team's first game. This would be when that sport could first schedule a competition, a game, or a wrestling date. And the reason that that's a longer or extended time period is in recognition that you don't see that same kind of a conflict that we do when we're talking with the fall sports, but we do want to rein it in a little bit so that we don't have our basketball teams beginning practice in August as an example. So those are the sports where we see a start date recommended for practices. Now for games, we see start dates recommended for fall sports, winter sports, and spring sports. So for our fall sports, we see that all of those fall sports of cross country, football, soccer, and women's volleyball would all be able to schedule their first competition on the fourth Thursday in August. Now the reason for this specific date is kind of balancing with how the Labor Day weekend falls and how that's oftentimes a key point in the athletic calendar of scheduling related to various tournaments and things like that. And recognizing that as we looked at calendars over a 10-year period, what are the variety of possible ways that the calendar could fall and how Labor Day can match up and all of those things. Recognizing that some years that date could be later and some years it could be earlier, the task force came back to the fourth Thursday in August being a key day to ensure that there is enough time to get in competitions in a number of these fall sports in an appropriate time frame as we kind of work our way towards the national championship time period. So for all of those fall sports, the fourth Thursday in August would be the first allowable date to schedule a competition. It does not mean that a team is required to schedule a competition that date. Rather, it's just the first time at which you would be able to. For our winter sports of basketball and wrestling, the start date for competition would be the last Thursday in October. So again, This is kind of circling around a weekend. Here we recognize that November 1st seems to be about an appropriate time to begin competitions in those sports, but we also recognize that there may be tournaments or other things that might start on a Friday or even a Thursday. So you'll see Thursday as a theme throughout all of these start dates for games for that exact reason. So basketball and wrestling is the last Thursday in October. And then as we move on to our spring sports of baseball, softball, and men's volleyball, in the three of those sports, the earliest date at which you could schedule those spring competitions would be Thursday of that last weekend in January. Again, it's kind of recognizing that somewhere around February 1 is when we often see competitive schedules starting or kind of needing to begin, but we want to make sure that teams have that full final weekend of January to kind of count from. So that's why you see a little bit of a change in terms of how each of these seasons is described. For all other sports that I did not mention, there is not any recommended change to the game limits or practice or game start dates. So just those sports that I have described here. One other key thing that I should mention related to our spring sports and game start dates is this proposal would not prevent those sports, so baseball or softball as an example, from playing in competitions in the fall. We know that a lot of our baseball teams may play fall games, fall competitions. That's absolutely permitted and can be done anytime after August 1st. So rather, when we turn from the fall term to the spring term, you would not be able to start competitions on January 8th. You would need to wait until that last Thursday in January to start those. Proposal 21B04 regarding wrestling frequency of play limits has been withdrawn. Our next proposal, 21B05, deals specifically with the sport of football and how we think about practice and specific timing related to practice for the sport of football. So currently right now in football, there are some specific regulations around the number of hours per day that a football team can practice and a distinction between on-field practice or physical workout and conditioning versus other things that would meet the NAIA definition of a practice but are not physical or on-field. So things like film review sessions or even a walkthrough on the field. Currently right now, for those sort of things that would not count towards this 3 hour per day limitation of physical on-field activity, we allow walkthroughs that may occur on the field as long as they don't have any sort of football implementation involved. So if that was to be the case right now under current rules, if you were to have a walkthrough and not involve any kind of football implement, those would not have to count in your 3 hour limit. What is coming forward to us in this proposal, proposed by the Football Coaches Association, is to allow those same walkthroughs to include an actual football. No other football implements, no pads, nothing like that, but an actual football to be able to be used in those walkthroughs and not change its designation. So still allow those walkthroughs to not have to count towards that 3 hour limit. Key thing to note in this proposal is that in all of these circumstances, these are all counted as practices. They are weeks towards the team's 24-week season. So none of that is changed under this proposal. It's simply a difference of that 3 hour on-field and physical activity limitation within football versus the total 4 hour limit, and wanting to just make a tweak in how the walkthroughs are able to occur, but not change where they fall in that 3 versus 4 hour designation. In just a moment, you will hear me describe proposals 21B06 and 21B07. Both of these proposals are on the same topic, which is inner terms and how do we treat them within the NAIA, and how is coursework earned within an inner term used towards a student athlete's eligibility. Now, both of these proposals talk about the same topic, but are actually in conflict with one another. They cannot both be passed into legislation. So we'll talk there in just a moment, the specifics of what each one is proposing to do, but I just want to describe how we will actually handle this in terms of how you as voting delegates will vote on these on Thursday at the annual business meeting. What we will do is we will take one vote, which is essentially a head-to-head vote of these two proposals. So you'll have the option to either vote for proposal 21B06 or proposal 21B07. And the idea is that this is your chance as membership to essentially vote or have a voice in terms of what should be considered for passage into NAIA bylaws. So whichever one of those two proposals was to get a greater outcome when they went into a head-to-head vote, we would then take that proposal that had more votes, and then we would treat it like any other typical legislative proposal where we would ask you as members to vote for it or against it or abstain. So in the end, the proposal could still fail or it could pass. Either way, this is simply how we will get to some resolution on how to handle two competing proposals. So our next proposal, 21B06, deals with interterms. So just to make this easy, I'll say those interterm sessions that occur between a fall semester and a spring semester. So currently, right now under NAIA regulations, an institution that sponsors an interterm session can declare how that interterm is treated for eligibility purposes. Does it attach to the fall, meaning a student who's eligible at the beginning of the fall gets to continue to be eligible all the way through the end of the fall term and through the end of the interterm? Or the school could choose to attach it to the spring, meaning if you're going to be eligible for the spring semester, you get to begin being eligible at the start of the interterm and all the way through. Or as an institution could choose to have their interterm stand alone, so basically be independent of either of those terms, meaning a student's eligibility could essentially fluctuate based on what occurs in the fall, what occurs in the interterm, and what occurs in the spring. So that's the current method right now, is that there are options for each institution to make when it comes to how they treat their own interterms. What this proposal seeks to do is to create one uniform standard that all NAIA institutions' interterms would be counted towards. In addition, it would help provide that same sort of uniform consistency towards interterm courses that a student athlete might take that are not offered by their current NAIA institution, that may be offered from a junior college or another institution, and how we evaluate those courses from a timing standpoint. So to start with, what this proposal does is it defines an interterm, and it specifically says all interterms will be treated as non-terms. That means a student won't be charged with a term of attendance. They won't be considered to be identifying with an institution based on enrollment in interterm. And it also means that any interterm coursework that student takes and completes, those would be considered non-term hours rather than term hours and having to figure out are those fall term hours, spring term hours, those sorts of things. In addition, it goes on to talk about the timing piece of this. So when a student does take and complete an interterm coursework, how do we treat that course? Let's say the student is looking to be eligible for the spring semester. How do we know if that interterm course gets to count and help them be eligible for the spring semester or not? So it kind of walks through a tiered or a stepping stone type of approach for how we determine exactly when that course gets to be considered completed. The underlying philosophy here is that interterm course has to be completed prior to the start of the NAIA institution's spring term in order for that coursework to be used towards spring eligibility. So the key is, how do we know when that interterm course is considered completed? So first and foremost, we would look at the transcript of the issuing institution, meaning the school where the student took the interterm course, to see how does that school treat this interterm course. When we look at that transcript, if that transcript specifically attributes that course to a particular term, we will rely on that and we will take that at face value. Meaning if that school says this is a winter intersession course or interterm course, we will consider it to be a winter interterm course regardless of the exact dates of when that course may have occurred or that sort of thing. Similarly, if that issuing institution said this is a spring course, we will consider it to be a spring course, again, regardless of the exact dates for when that term or that course may have been completed. We will rely on that issuing transcript. Beyond that, again, the intention is to continue relying on the issuing institution, but what if we have to go a little bit further? What if it's not quite as clear on the issuing school's transcript of what term that course is attributed to? So if the transcript from the issuing school does not say what term it's attributed to, the next thing to look at would be is if that issuing transcript says dates of the course. We see that sometimes, that it'll say this course occurred January 1st to January 12th. If that was the case, we would compare that final date, that January 12th date, against the NAIA school spring term. And as long as the spring term at the NAIA school occurred after January 12th, we would be able to say this interterm course was completed prior to the start of the spring term. Those course hours could be used towards spring eligibility, and so on. Now, if neither of those appears on the issuing school's transcript, the third method would be to say, we will go to the registrar of the issuing institution and ask them to verify for us what were the dates of that coursework for that particular course. And we would take those dates and compare them against the NAIA institution's spring term. So again, it's kind of a stair-step approach of if not this, then this, in terms of how we would identify when that interterm coursework was completed. And the intention is to be able to use that coursework as an interterm course. We would need to ensure that that interterm course was completed before the start of the NAIA school's spring course. One other thing I should mention is that in all of these cases, we would need for the grades to appear on the transcript and be completed in the normal manner. And if this is a student who is continuing on at your NAIA institution, so they just took a winter interterm course from another institution, but they've continued to maintain identification on your campus, then consistent with how we view a number of other rules, we would say in addition to looking at how that interterm course is treated on its transcript, we also need to ensure that those coursework hours, those credits, are accepted and approved by your NAIA institution. Again, that's consistent with how we view a variety of things related to earned credit hours when you have a continuing student on your campus. Our next proposal, 21B07, deals with the same topic that we just discussed in the last proposal, but with a slightly different objective. So in this case, again, we're talking about interterm courses and when they're completed, or how we get to use that interterm credit towards a student's spring eligibility. But it gets there in a little bit different way. So in this case, the sponsors are proposing that all we really care about, what we're really looking at, is when the specific dates of that interterm coursework were, and that's what we should focus on. So in this case, the proposal says that as long as we can see that the dates of that student's particular course were completed, or the student completed the course prior to the start of the NAIA spring term, then they get to use that course towards spring eligibility from there on. The key distinction here is that we would say, in this case, under this proposal, that the dates of the course supersede what may appear on the transcript. So no matter how that issuing institution shows the interterm coursework, if they say it's attributed to winter, spring, etc., the key part here under this proposal would be we need to know the exact dates of that particular course. And as long as those exact dates occur prior to the start of the institution's spring term, that course could then be used towards spring eligibility. So as an example, if a student takes an intersession course or an interterm course from an institution, and that institution calls it a spring session, if we can see that the dates of that particular course were concluded prior to the start of the NAIA school spring term, we would say that under this proposal, that course gets to be treated as an intersession course, even though the transcript calls it a spring course. So a key thing to note there is, in this case, would be looking past or ignoring what the transcript says. So that would need to carry on throughout the student's academic and athletic career as we think about that course being used towards eligibility. So when we think about it for identification purposes, when we think about it for the 24-36-hour rule in future terms, you would have to have some method of tracking course by course and ensuring that we're not just relying on the transcript any longer, that we have some sort of notation or tracking method to ensure that we know that at one point we treated this course as a winter intersession. So from that point forward, we need to continue treating this course as a winter intersession or interterm course, no matter what the transcript says. So that would be a key point of this particular proposal, is being able to track that throughout. The one other thing related to this proposal is, again, how do we define what the dates of that course are? So in this case, the sponsors have proposed the language of, we would rely on either the institution's academic calendar, its academic catalog, and or via the institution's website to be able to identify what the particular dates of that particular course are for that analysis of if the course was completed prior to the NAIA institution's spring term. This next proposal, 21B08, deals with the seasons of competition rule, or the rule that describes how or when a student is charged a season of competition. So for many of you, this will not be an unfamiliar proposal, as the Competitive Experience Committee has been working towards a variety of successive proposals in recent years, taking it kind of piece by piece in each successive year. So this is the final piece of the Competitive Experience Committee's work towards kind of revamping how and when we decide to charge students with seasons of competition. So this particular component is specific to what we call non-intercollegiate competition. So when a student is not representing your institution in competition, that's not impacted here. What we're talking about is when the student's playing on a club team or running in individual events on their own. How do we determine when those should charge the student with a season of competition? So for the last 10 or so years, that guideline or that standard has been at elite level criteria. And to determine what is elite level criteria, we've had a set of what we call evaluative criteria that would walk through the specifics of looking at a team sport or an individual sport and how we determine if that particular competition or that particular team or league met this elite level criteria. And the intention is that elite level was roughly approximate to NAIA level of competition. So when you're participating on behalf of an NAIA team, you're charged a season of competition, or when you play an outside competition that's roughly at the same standard, you would be charged as well. This proposal coming from the Competitive Experience Committee relates back to what their perspective is of the experience we have had over these last number of years by using that approach. And there's a few primary principles that have led them to believe that we need to adjust that approach. So their intention is to raise the bar, is to raise that standard, recognizing that the specifics of all of these criteria have made it to where it can be difficult for a student, prospective student, or a current student athlete, or even NAIA coaches or administrators to be able to identify in advance if a particular team or a particular competition is going to end up charging that student with a season of competition. So some concern that's a little too complicated, a little too complex, and so therefore not very transparent. There's also been concern that it also can tend to charge some students with seasons of competition for an event or a league that, as we look at it, might not feel like it should be charged with a season of competition, but by those evaluative criteria, that is the end result. So for all of those reasons, the Competitive Experience Committee here and this proposal are seeking to raise the standard and also find a way to do so that is a little bit simpler, as well as more transparent in terms of what the end result will be, so that prospective student athletes, current student athletes, and NAIA coaches and administrators can all have a better understanding and know what kind of impact will come from a student participating in an event or in a league. So what this does is it raises that level of competition from being at elite level, or approximately NAIA level of competition, and it raises the bar to essentially being professional level competition. So to do so, or exactly how do we determine that? There's a few criteria listed in this proposal. So the first would be, for any team sport, team or league that self-declares, calls itself a professional team or league, automatically we're going to say that meets the standard, and if the student competes in that team or league, they're going to be charged with a season of competition. Similarly, taking the same approach of self-declaration, if a team or a league self-declares itself to be a semi-professional team or league, we would look at that, but we recognize that sometimes that semi-professional language is used largely for marketing purposes and not because it relates to the actual level of competition. So to kind of combat that, and what we're trying to aim at are those teams or those leagues that truly are higher level competition. If a team or league self-declares as semi-professional, we would say in that case we would also need to see that the team or the league pays participants above and beyond travel, meals, and lodging, or reimburses participants above and beyond just that travel, meals, and lodging. So if both of those things occur, then again we would say, all right, that meets the standard and the student is charged a season of competition. Then as it relates to individual sports, for evaluating those, the standard would be if that event or that league self-declares as professional or semi-professional, we would be treating that as charging the student with a season of competition. Specific to those individual sports, a lot of times there may be events that take both kind of all comers as well as have a division or a series specifically for professionals or those sorts of things. So in this case, we would be looking at the individual students competition and say, did you run in this 5K in the professionals division, or did you run in kind of the all comers division, the fun run side of things. So we'd be evaluating it based on the particular student's heat or series or division that they participated in. Another key to know is that this would be effective in May of 2022 for eligibility decisions beginning in August of 2022. So what that means is this would not go into effect in this coming year. The reason that there's a May date is because that's when the NAIA Eligibility Center begins to offer decisions for August of 2022. So that's just some clarification on why that date looks a little different. It would not impact any competition that occurs in May of 2022, or that kind of final month of spring sports. Our next proposal, 21B09, also deals with the seasons of competition regulation, but in a much smaller way. So there is a now, under recent legislation, a small sliver of students that would still be eligible for a medical hardship. And traditional rules related to medical hardship say that a doctor has to declare that the student has sustained a season-ending injury or illness. And then that doctor has to either be an MD or a DO. This proposal would seek to increase that category of available doctors who are able to make that designation to also now include a DPM, which is a doctor of podiatric medicine. It's basically a foot doctor. So it would just expand that category of physicians who are able to make that declaration. This proposal, 21B10, is really kind of a continuation of something that we have seen come out of a special COVID year type of an exception related to initial eligibility criteria. But it is also something that we have been working towards for a while in recent years with the Council of Faculty Athletic Representatives and the Initial Eligibility Task Force that was looking at NAIA initial eligibility requirements. So in both of those circumstances, there was recognition that class rank letters, one of the traditional requirements or available options of initial eligibility, are less and less available to students today in high school. And in addition, we continue to see that ACT and SAT scores continue to be less utilized by students as colleges are more frequently becoming test optional. COVID and the pandemic has certainly enhanced or amplified those sorts of challenges. So in this past year, there was a special exception made to allow students to become eligible to compete in the NAIA based purely off of their high school GPA. What the current proposal does is takes a version of that and seeks to make it a permanent change in the NAIA. So under this proposal, in addition to the 2 out of 3 approach, the approach we have always had, that will continue to remain as an available option for incoming freshmen to be eligible. In addition to that, what this proposal would do would be to create another path towards eligibility for incoming freshmen. And it would say that if your high school GPA is 2.3 or higher, you can be eligible in the NAIA. There are no additional criteria that you would have to satisfy, not a test score, not a class rank, or anything like that. There are no additional criteria you would have to satisfy to be eligible in the NAIA. You would have to be identified at your NAIA institution, you'd have to be certified as eligible, and all of those sorts of things. But essentially, from a substantive standpoint, that 2.3 GPA at a high school would be enough to do it. In addition, you may be familiar with the early decision criteria, which basically looks at a student's progress or performance after 6 or 7 semesters in high school and identifies if they could be eligible for that final decision early. And the thought process behind that currently is that we look at a GPA standard that is high enough that no matter what the student's performance was in their last 1 or 2 semesters of high school, they would not mathematically be able to drop below the standard we would expect. So currently, under the 2 out of 3 approach, that's a 2.0 standard. Under this approach, we'd be saying we'd expect a 2.3 requirement at high school graduation. So from an early decision standpoint, what that means is if after a student's 6th semester of high school, if they have a 3.3 GPA, they would be eligible for an early decision, saying that they're eligible in the NAIA. Again, we've run the numbers to ensure that that student would not be able to fall under a 2.3 at that point in time. Similarly, after a student's 7th semester of high school, we would say that as long as that student has at least a 2.8 high school GPA, they would be eligible for an early decision, stating that they were able to compete in the NAIA. Proposal 21B11 also deals with initial eligibility, but is specific to our homeschooled student athletes. So you may remember that a year or two ago, we passed legislation in the NAIA that allowed an available possible criteria for a standard domestic student coming from high school to be that they could aid their eligibility by earning 9 or more institutional credit hours, so college credit hours, prior to ever identifying at any institution of higher education. So those might be hours that they take in the summer between high school and college, could be AP or dual credit hours, something along those lines. So what this proposal does is it seeks to take that same approach and apply it to homeschooled students. Traditionally with homeschooled students, we know that we have challenges in identifying appropriate criteria to evaluate those homeschooled students on because we do not rely on a homeschool GPA or a homeschool class rank. So historically, we have either relied on an appropriate ACT or SAT score, or that student has had to go through a process to request a waiver from the NAIA Homeschool Committee. Under this proposal, it would create a third avenue for those homeschooled students that would say, if a homeschooled student has completed 9 or more institutional credit hours prior to ever identifying at any institution of higher education, and they've passed those 9 or more credit hours with a grade of C or better, that would be a criteria that would enable the homeschooled student to get a determination of eligible from the NAIA. So under that criteria alone, the homeschooled student would be able to be eligible. (21B12) also relates to eligibility, but is focused on those students who have already completed their undergraduate coursework. So in the NAIA currently, there are a variety of ways for a student who's completed their undergraduate coursework to still be able to pursue additional coursework of some kind and continue competing in the NAIA. So right now that category includes any professional or graduate school coursework that a student may be participating and enrolled in. It also includes post-baccalaureate 5th year teacher degree education programs. Under this proposal, we would expand that current category to also include another option, which would be any post-baccalaureate certificate program that a student might pursue. And if enrolled in that coursework, the student would be able to continue to compete in the NAIA. Now, this expects that the student does have NAIA eligibility remaining, so both seasons of competition and terms of attendance remaining. It would also require that the student must be enrolled in that program full-time. So unlike undergraduate work, where we require 12 hours enrollment for the student to be eligible to compete, in any of these categories, so the graduate or professional school, the 5th year post-baccalaureate teacher degree program, or here under this proposal with the post-baccalaureate certificate program, we would say that the student has to be enrolled full-time in that program, but the number of hours is as defined by the particular program. So whatever is considered full-time by that program would satisfy the NAIA requirement in terms of enrollment and identification. (21B13) deals with the NAIA progress rule. So you may know that currently the NAIA progress rule really has 2 components. So one component says that after you've completed your first season of competition, from that point forward, every additional season that you seek to play in, you have to have successively earned 24 hours to play in your next season. So what that means is to play in your second season of competition, you have to have earned 24 hours. The thought being that in your first year of school, you earn the 24 institutional credit hours. You have to have done that to play in your second season. To play in your third season, you have to have earned 48 credit hours at a semester institution. And to play in your fourth season, you would have to have earned 72 hours. And there are similar comparisons for quarter institutions on that side of things. The other piece of the progress rule also says that by the time you hit your third season of competition, you have to have a 2.0 cumulative collegiate GPA from that point forward to compete. So both in your third season and in your fourth season. What this proposal would do would actually expand the class of students that 2.0 GPA applies to. So it would say that essentially students would have to begin meeting that 2.0 GPA from the time at which they begin to play in their second season of competition. Now there is a caveat to that, which says that if a student is going to play in their second season of competition, but their prior season of competition, their first season, was for non-intercollegiate play, we would not apply this 2.0 GPA requirement to them. The reason being that we recognize a student may, as an example, have a break coming out of high school into college, they compete in a team or league, and they're charged a season of competition. So they lose one season and they're coming into their NAIA institution and will immediately be playing in their second season. But they haven't done any coursework yet. So in recognition of the fact that there are those types of situations that occur, there is a little bit of leeway given there for those students whose first season would have been charged for non-intercollegiate play. So this rule would not apply to them in their second season. Note that the standard progress rule that's in effect right now would continue to apply to those students, meaning that when they compete in their third season of competition, they would be required to have earned that 2.0 GPA at that point in time. The other key thing to note here is that this is specific just to a student's second season of competition. Currently, under the progress rule and another eligibility rule that we have, we say that when a student meets junior status athletically, so their third season, but also academically, once they're defined as a junior student on your campus, they have to meet that 2.0 GPA requirement. Note that under this proposal, there is not a similar expansion of saying once you hit sophomore status, you have to have a 2.0 GPA. This is just about your second season of competition. It does not apply to your sophomore academic status. (21B14) deals with recertification, or basically when you have a student who's been eligible in the fall and you're seeking to determine if they're still eligible to compete moving forward into the spring. So currently under the NAIA regulations, you would have 30 days to determine if that student is eligible. So get the grades in, time to get any transcripts if the student has taken school or taken hours at other institutions, and basically make that decision related to if they have continued their eligibility or not. And you have this 30-day window in which, while you don't yet know if they're eligible, they're able to continue competing. There is current language in that says if you have determined the student to be ineligible at any point during that 30 days, the point at which you determine that they are ineligible, that student needs to stop competing immediately. What this proposal does is it just seeks to clarify that language, knowing that in the past there has been some ambiguity of how does this apply and when does it apply. What does it mean to declare a student ineligible? So under this proposal, there's some clarification language related to any point in time at which you not just declare the student, meaning to some people that would mean put them on an eligibility certificate or complete the rest of your eligibility certificate for the team. But by changing that word from declare to discover, it's any point in time at which you realize that they are going to be ineligible, you need to stop that student from continuing to compete any further. It also goes through the process of relying on the eligibility certificate process and stating that when you are going through that process and determining all of your students' eligibility, that's what we would rely on for that time period. So again, this is not a large substantive change, it's more of a clarification over how that existing rule should apply. So here again, we have another example of where we have two competing proposals. 21B15 and 21B16 both deal with our infractions section, so specifically penalties that may be applied to a student who has competed inelibly. And again here, we have two differing thoughts or ideas about how this should be treated or how our current bylaws should be adjusted. So just like we discussed a few moments ago, here the way we will handle that in terms of voting procedure is that we will ask membership to vote on a head-to-head vote of these two proposals. So either vote in favor of 15 or in favor of B16. Whichever gets more votes will be the one that we ask membership to officially vote in terms of whether it will be adopted into NAIA legislation or if it would fail, or a member would always have the opportunity to abstain. So we will follow that same procedure here with 21B15 and 21B16. (21B15) deals with our current regulations around infractions or penalties and how and when students are charged seasons of competition after they've competed inelibly. So this proposal seeks to limit when and how students can be charged additional seasons of competition. So within this proposal, the first thing it does is clarifies that if a student competes inelibly, they're charged a season in the same way that any student who competes is charged, pursuant with Article 5, Section B, Item 18. So that first piece is clarification. The next piece that this proposal does is it removes language that says a student would just be charged automatically with a second season or a punitive season of competition. The proposal then specifies that in cases where a student athlete has provided false or incomplete information or has withheld information, if any of those apply, then the student could face additional penalties, all the way up to charging additional punitive seasons of competition, or it could be being withheld from future games or competitions, or even being permanently ineligible in the NAIA. Any of those types of additional penalties could apply, but only if that student has been providing false or incomplete information or has withheld information. If it's a different type of a reason that the student competed ineligibly, the student would not be subject to additional penalties under this proposal. So it would seek to limit what is currently permitted by the bylaws and may be applied by current NAIA governance committees when there are ineligible students. B16 also deals with the same section of our infractions regulations about penalties that apply to a student when they have played ineligibly. But this proposal, unlike the prior one, seeks to clarify the current language that's currently there, but not really further limit it. So this proposal similarly seeks to clarify that at first a student is charged a season for competing ineligibly, just in the same way that any student who plays eligibly is charged a season. You're charged for competing. This proposal then goes on to say that for playing ineligibly, the appropriate committee, which likely means our National Eligibility Committee or possibly our National Conduct and Ethics Committee, could apply additional penalties. Those might include game suspensions, it might include additional seasons of competition, or it might include being permanently ineligible in the NAIA. The sponsors of this proposal, the National Eligibility Committee, are seeking to apply this proposal or this amendment to current regulations because right now the current language of the bylaws can be interpreted to say that a student who plays ineligibly should be charged a punitive or second season of competition for playing ineligibly. And the National Eligibility Committee has long tried to strike a balance to possibly apply some lesser penalties to a student who has played in a limited amount of competitions while ineligible. So by making this clarification, it provides the National Eligibility Committee with more opportunity to determine how to be flexible in those types of circumstances. This proposal seeks to change some of the composition of a handful of NAIA standing committees to include representation from the Athletics Compliance Administrators Association. So this impacts 5 of our standing committees: the National Conduct and Ethics Committee, the Competitive Experience Committee, the National Eligibility Committee, the Committee on Leadership, Diversity and Inclusion, and the NAIA Homeschool Committee. So with the Conduct and Ethics Committee and the Competitive Experience Committee, under this proposal, each of those committees would have 2 additional spots or seats added to them that would then be filled by an athletics compliance administrator. So essentially increasing the size of each of those committees to also include some representation from the ACAA. For the National Eligibility Committee, under this proposal, that committee that's currently a committee of 5 individuals would stay a committee of 5 individuals, but would specify that instead of all 5 of those individuals being people who are faculty athletic representative or have that same sort of similar past experience, it would say that 3 of those individuals would now be faculty athletic representatives and 2 would become athletic compliance administrators. If approved, important to note that this would be applied at the next regularly occurring election cycles, meaning that there would not be an overnight change to the makeup of that committee, but rather as members of the committee roll off as their terms expire, that in selecting and nominating upcoming members, we would look to find members of the Athletic Compliance Administrator Association to fill those spots to become compliant with this legislation, if approved. In addition, the Committee on Leadership, Diversity and Inclusion and the Homeschool Committee, this proposal seeks to take some of those at-large spots that currently exist on both of those organizations and transition them from being at-large to instead being specific to being filled by members of the Athletic Compliance Administrator Association. So similarly, in both of those cases, we would apply this at the next regularly occurring election cycle rather than remove people from their current positions. B18 again seeks to edit or adjust some of our standing committee representation. But under this proposal, what we are seeking to do is expand who can represent the Athletic Directors Association on a handful of these standing committees. So this proposal is specific to the Awards and Hall of Fame Committee, the Champions of Character Advisory Committee, and the National Drug Testing and Education Committee. Currently, on each of those three standing committees, there are positions specifically reserved for representatives from the Athletic Directors Association, or the ADA. Under this proposal, it seeks to ensure that not only could athletic directors represent the ADA, but also assistant or associate athletic directors could represent the ADA if nominated and selected by the ADA. So it would still be up to the Athletic Directors Association to determine who their representative is to each of these three standing committees, but it would simply expand that designation to be able to go to an assistant or an associate athletic director as well. This proposal, 21B19, again seeks to edit the composition of some of our NAIA standing committees. Under this proposal, the intention here is to create additional positions or edit some positions on a variety of standing committees to ensure that there are female or minority members on these various standing committees. So this proposal impacts the Awards and Hall of Fame Committee, the Competitive Experience Committee, the National Conduct and Ethics Committee, the National Eligibility Committee, the Committee on Leadership, Diversity, and Inclusion, the Champions of Character Advisory Committee, and the National Drug Testing and Education Committee. So in the vast majority of these committees, the proposal is to say that we would either increase the entire size of that committee to include additional spots or positions for female or minority members. And in the case of the National Eligibility Committee, what it does is to say we would strongly encourage that as selections to that committee are made, that gender and minority representation are taken into account. The reason that committee is listed a little bit differently here is in recognition that, number one, the size of that committee, based on the sheer volume of information that it has and the level of experience needed to be on the committee, the size of that committee is not intended to be increased, and also recognizes that on that committee specifically, with the expertise and technical knowledge necessary to be on that committee, that the key part is to ensure that individuals nominated and selected are truly qualified by experience. So while recognizing that diversity and inclusion is certainly a key priority in all of our committees, here it's encouraged rather than required. In addition, in a couple of the other committees, we may see that in addition to just enlarging some of those committees to add female or minority representation, we may be shifting an at-large spot to a female or minority position. So again, any of those changes that would impact current makeup of the council or committee, those would occur at the next regularly occurring election cycle, so no one would be removed from any of these councils or committees before their term ends, as an example. We would just edit the composition at the next election cycle if needed. If for those places that are just expanding the size of a committee or council, we would work with that committee to do so as appropriate, as that could occur sooner. B20 is another proposal that is looking at female and minority representation, but this time it's looking at our associations within the NAIA. So this proposal focuses specifically on two different associations. So one association is the Association for Student Athletes. So currently that is a group of about 30 to 35 NAIA student athletes. And it is currently split between members of male sports and members of female sports. So there's not a need here to ensure that there are spots reserved for female student athletes. That's already taken care of. What this proposal would do is ensure that there are 4 at-large spots reserved on the Association of Student Athletes for minority members. So that's the first part of this proposal. The second part speaks specifically to our NAIA coaches associations. So all of our coaches associations have an executive committee or a leadership group of that coaching body. So typically 4 or 5, maybe 6 officers of that coaches association who do a lot of business and essentially lead the association throughout the year. So what this proposal would do is say that at least one of those executive committee members needs to be a female or minority individual. So this would also, just like in prior proposals, we'd see that this would also apply at the next regularly occurring election cycle. So if, as an example, we had a coaches group that currently did not have any female or minority members on that executive committee, at the next time where there's a transition of terms in another election cycle, we would seek to ensure that whoever was nominated onto the executive committee would either be a female or a minority. So thank you so much for joining us here today and hearing about this year's slate of legislative proposals. For more information on the legislative proposals, you can see additional resources linked to this session within the NAIA convention platform. You can also find additional resources on the convention legislation page found on naia.org. In addition to this session where you can hear about legislation and the resources just described, we will also have a caucus for all membership on Wednesday, at which time you can come and ask questions that you may have. You could advocate for or against proposals, or you can simply come to listen to hear that feedback from others in the membership. That will be followed by our annual business meeting on Thursday afternoon, where, again, there's an opportunity to ask questions, advocate for or against proposals, and ultimately we will vote on each proposal and determine which proposals are approved and passed into NAIA legislation. Thank you so much and have a great day.